Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Emma, for the introduction. Delighted to welcome you all to the annual Scarman Lecture. Especially welcome to Jack and Chryssy, our guest speakers for the event. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nishan Canagarajah. I'm the President and the Vice-Chancellor, and my pronouns are he and him. I just want to say very few things why this event is important. And for those who have attended this event will know this has a very rich history. Since 2008, Scarman Lectures have attracted some eminent speakers, and Neil Chakrabarty, one of our professors in the School of Criminology, just told me one of the people who attended, which I didn't know about, was Keir Starmer. And I knew about David Lammy and lots of other Kalwan Bhopal, and all these people who have come to deliver this lecture because it is a prestigious lecture series. From my perspective as the Vice-Chancellor, one of the reasons I'm really pleased to be here is what I would like to make sure this university is truly inclusive. That where everybody is welcome, where everybody is treated with dignity and respect, where they can be themselves. And I think that's absolutely critical for me. It has been since the day I arrived. I've set out that clearly as my ambition. And I'm proud of the work that the university has done on many fronts to demonstrate that inclusion. So, for example, we appointed our first female chancellor in our history of 100 years when we appointed Dame Maggie Pocock. For those of you who know, she's the Sky at Night presenter. And the other thing that we have been able to do is to think about our demography of our staff and student profile. And we have significantly diversified our student demography and our staff demography. For example, the number of people are happily disclosed their LGBT has gone up from about 5% to 9% among students. So I'm really pleased that the students and staff feel they can be themselves and openly discuss and express themselves. But I don't want this to be, the inclusion just to be about representation, because I think that is important. You can't have inclusion without representation. So I think representation is important. Visible leadership is important. And diverse leadership is important. And again, you will see in, for example, in my senior team, I want to demonstrate that as well. So I have 11 colleagues, and we want to ensure that is diverse as much as possible. But I also want to make sure that diversity and inclusion is embedded in our core activities. For our example, in our educational content, our educational program, how do we assess our students? And there have been significant progress we have made on that front as well, where we have taken a critical look at our content and assessment practices. Similarly, in our research activity, we are a research-intensive university. We want to, again, make sure that our research reflects that diversity. This morning, I was launching a national workshop. We have partners from India, Nepal, Bangladesh, because we are leading a major health program, £10 million health program, to look at how certain health conditions, multiple long-term conditions, affect different ethnic communities around the world. And we are working with them in partnership. These are some examples, and obviously in our School of Criminology, you will have the Center for Hate Studies. And our Archaeology and Museum and History department is looking at trans-inclusive museums and heritage sector. These are absolutely good. That's what I mean by inclusion. It's not a box ticking, hey, I have a diverse student body, I have a diverse staff body. That is important. We still have to maintain that. But we also want to see how we can make a difference in the content. And in fact, I don't know whether there is a causal relationship, but I like to think there is some element of that involved. So this year, completely nice welcome news this month, in fact, we have been nominated as University of the Year by 3 independent publications. I just wish that they gave me one every year. I have one to talk about every year rather than all in one go. But nevertheless, I'm happy to say that we have 3 Times and Sunday Times last Sunday shortlisted as our University of the Year, Times Higher Education, and all said, in many of their citations, they said Leicester is a model university. It is a university that reflects inclusion. So I'm really proud that in some ways it is getting the recognition it deserves. But more importantly, I think we also looked at how we support our students. And there are a number of changes we have made in our support services. So our students, whatever their needs are, we can support them to the best as we can. That is not to say we have done everything. There is more to do, but that is why these kinds of conversations are important. So I'm delighted we have eminent speakers today to have a discussion around these topics where we can, as a university, have the courage to have difficult conversations and see how we can move these topics forward and make progress. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Welcome everyone. I am Dr. Rachel Keithley and I use she, they pronouns, and alongside my colleague Dr. Canagarajah, who uses he, him pronouns, we are delighted to chair today's talks and events. Now, it's important to start by saying that the content of today's talks may in some parts be distressing to some, and therefore would like to deliver a content warning regarding possible references of harm towards trans folk, including references of violence and hate crime. There's also some breakout rooms if you just go out the door and upstairs. If anyone did want to use that space, please do feel free to do so and come back in if and when you feel ready to. Now, before we introduce today's speakers, we also want to set out an ethos of respect. This is a safe space for all LGBTQ+ individuals, and it's important to note that the existence of trans people and their lives and rights are not up for debate. We want to start by recognising the current and historic criminalisation and marginalisation of trans folk and other members of the LGBTQ+ communities. As of 2024, 14 countries actively criminalised the gender identity and/or expression of transgender people. In many more countries, trans people are targeted by a range of laws that further marginalise their identities and are regularly the victims of discrimination, hate speech, and hate crime. In the UK itself, we have witnessed the steady rise in reporting and experiences of hate crimes targeting trans folk. The practice of conversion therapy on LGBTQ+ individuals is still legal, and there are no laws recognising trans parenthood. Equally, it would be remiss of us to not comment on the hostile environment towards migrants and asylum seekers towards and within this country. The UK currently makes it hard for people to seek asylum based on their gender identity, and nor are there any policies in place to help trans folk receive even basic healthcare upon arrival. These are the real and tangible experiences and harms experienced by trans folk every day in this country.
Okay, so thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Nishan, for your introduction, and thank you all for being here. Needless to say that we are absolutely elated to be doing this today with you all. So whilst we sought to give some reference to the inequalities trans people face, today's panel does not really want to rehash on this, although we do encourage you to look at that particular type of activist and scholarly work. So today we want to draw your attention to a growing resistance, a movement in which trans lives are celebrated, uplifted, and joy is found. In an era marked by reactionary politics, we think it's crucial to foster positive visions of trans futurity, while at the same time acknowledging the current climate of violence and inequity that unfortunately we're living in. So through reimagining trans futures today, our two speakers aim to reset the narrative around trans lives, demonstrating the possibility and importance of queer joy as a main motor of politics, of a politics of resistance. So today's first paper will be given by Dr. Chryssy Hunter, thank you, who currently works for in the women's sector and has a long work and volunteering experience within LGBTQI+ organizations. For her talk today, Dr. Hunter will draw on her research and advocacy work with elder trans communities across the country. She will explore the experiences of aging trans people in the UK, emphasizing their relevance across generations and reading their experiences as sources of inspiration and emancipation for us all. Following this, Dr. Jack Lopez will draw on his research and activist scholarship with trans adults across the country. Jack is the member of the Health Board at Trans Actual UK and an academic consultant for the Inclusion Crowd project. In his talk today, he will delve into reimagining trans futures, spotlighting the resistance and the resilience and the liberation which are part and parcel of trans narratives, which often are not told about. So finally, our goal today is to challenge negativity and amplify the strength inherent in trans experiences. This event was conceived with the idea to leave all participants, trans, queer, cis, and allies, empowered with a sense of critical joy. And without further ado, I will leave the floor to our first speaker, Dr. Chryssy Hunter. Thank you very much.
First of all, can you hear me at the back? It's clear, yeah? Good, because my voice is quite quiet. So, good evening. This evening we're going to think about trans futures and queer joy. I'll suggest that, although as trans non-binary people we live in challenging times, that if we take a historical perspective, we can still find cause for measured optimism and can hold out for a measure of trans or queer joy. I'm going to draw on research that I've carried out over the last 12 years, focusing on the testaments of older trans people. I'll highlight how, in the 21st century, certain key conditions have materialised, which, while they cannot be called unambiguously positive and beneficial, have supported the conditions under which, as a constituency, trans people have emerged as a recognised feature and force within society in a way that in the past we weren't. I think this is true to the extent that I believe it will prove impossible to put the genie back into the bottle or to morally mandate trans people out of existence. So, we're living, to quote trans poet Nat Raha, under bitter, disenfranchising conditions. She was talking in general about the life conditions of the majority of people under neoliberalism. But of course these apply to trans non-binary people as much as anyone else. She wrote these remarks in 2015, a year before we travelled to the first International Trans Studies Conference in Arizona, characterised earlier this month by TJ Ballard at the second International Trans Studies Conference as riding the high of the transgender tipping point. This was shortly before Trump was elected in the States and just before the backlash to proposals for self-ID for trans people in the UK really gathered pace and developed into the concerted and ongoing anti-trans environment that we find ourselves currently experiencing. The theme of the Trans Studies Conference earlier in September was the state of the post-discipline. This emerged as a response to the need to ground discussions in what Ruth Pierce described in her blog from the event as the importance of a materialist approach to trans studies in which our research can speak helpfully to the reality of people's lives. This necessarily involves grounding our work in practical examples of trans realities and understanding our histories in order to better tackle the challenges of the present and future. This seems helpful in the context of this talk. I won't theorise anything about sex or gender here, but we'll refer to the material reality of trans lives, focusing on how this has changed over the last 60 years or so, and how these changes can positively inform our responses to the conditions we are currently living under. There emerged in the mid-20th century the familiar transsexual pathways enabling men to surgically and chemically transition into women and women into men. This construction, however, was not altogether a liberation for everyone. Compulsory femininity and masculinity, as well as compulsory heterosexuality and deep selves, were enforced in order to access gender-appropriate treatments. Many people were forced to concede their selfhoods to enable their transitions. Many of my research participants who were older trans people told me broadly similar stories about their lives. of growing up in the 1950s, 60s and 70s, knowing either that something was wrong, or more specifically, that they experienced a persistent feeling that they should be a boy or should be a girl when they had been assigned otherwise at birth. But also telling me that back then, such thoughts were either almost unthinkable, or if thinkable, almost certainly unrealizable. For example, Helen is a mature woman who identifies as female with a transsexual history. However, she identified as a transvestite for an awful long time. This was the identity that she had access to that made sense to her at the time. And she describes the circumscribed conditions in which she began presenting in public on the slide. The first time I went out in public was 1963, 64, 63 I think. I caught a train from Cambridge to Liverpool Street and changed in the loos on the train. And then went on the Underground and Piccadilly Circus and then went back again. So, and then a couple of years later, I moved to London and would do my shopping dressed en femme, if I possibly could, using the same sort of facilities to change in. Helen was doing all this by herself. She had no networks because there were no networks, and she had no language. She didn't even know there was a name for cross-dressing at the time. What brought her out of isolation was when I started dressing again in the 80s. I'd become aware that trans people also went to gay venues, and I could identify where they were. I was coming across the Manchester Gay Village, then I really got involved with it. And that's when I got involved in a lesbian relationship. And that was all before I started my treatment. Helen is a remarkable, strong woman. She persevered all by herself in metaphorical darkness until she began to find community in the LGB world that began to emerge overground in the late 70s and early 80s, particularly in certain parts of the United Kingdom. But her story, one of isolation, of cyclical self-loathing, and of not having a way forward to live as her authentic self, powerfully illuminates the barriers faced by trans people in the UK and described to me by many other respondents as recently as the second half of the 20th century. Who knows how many other Helens and Harrys there were? But mainly, we were mostly in the darkness. In the second half of the 1990s, something happened that changed many people's lives. And initially, at first, undoubtedly for the better. Trans pioneer Stephen Whittle, in his paper, The Trans-Siberian Mailway, described the internet as a place where users could interact in communities of interest and explore fuller potentials of their personhood, freed from daily sociocultural constraints and thereby democratizing virtual environments. The development of virtual subcultural communities is something that has long been held to have been one of the factors, along with a developing body of theory and activism, that helps support the growth of trans communities, something echoed strongly by many of my respondents. As Whittle notes, the growth of the home computer use in the 1990s was crucial to the development of a newly formed, geographically dispersed, diverse trans community in the 1990s. Online, this newly formed community was able to discuss its experiences of fear, shame, discrimination, and as a result, many community members developed newly politicized personal identities. Whittle describes a cohesive trans community which had been afforded the space, and initially at least, anonymity granted by virtual spaces for people to begin to engage with and explore their own hitherto unadmitted, undisclosed, or unrealized sex-gender identities. On the back of the growth of the internet, the people I am talking about, those hidden in the darkness, began to emerge, blinking, into the still sometimes shadowy world of naughty's chat rooms. Ben also benefited from his positive experience of the internet. Ben had read about male-to-female transition, but hadn't come across any reports of female-to-male. So the first part on the slide. I knew that men could become ladies. I'd heard of that, but I'd never heard that women could become men. Never heard of it at all. So I assumed I was a freak, and I assumed that I was the only one, because I'd never heard of that. Somehow, couldn't see that being female and going to be male was normal, and I felt it was this deep, dirty secret. I needed to know that it was a real standing thing. And although I knew I'd had it all my life, it was just sort of, really? Really? And can something be done about it? And finally, Lee. Lee is a trans activist who worked in Sheffield for a number of years. Discussing transmasculine sexualities, he plotted the development from transnormativity to diversity. Lee went from a position of very little information. You very rarely heard about people being trans, and you rarely heard about gender identity stuff. So I knew there was something that wasn't quite right, and therefore I thought it must be my sexuality, and kind of went down that route of thinking of himself pre-transition as lesbian. There was very little information out there, so when I was first exploring my gender identity, I didn't realise I was exploring it. When I first started T-Boys in 2002, the community felt very much like you had to be straight. Very little idea about being queer, genderqueer, anything like that. It was, you're male and you're straight. And then you got whisperings of people identifying as genderqueer or more, and more people saying, well, I might be bi or I might be gay. More and more people being much more open about their sexuality. I've got so many more of these stories. People who lived in the darkness and were now coming into at least the dawn and possibly the light. And as this last example shows, people also opening up to new possibilities within their explorations of being trans. So, I've tried to give a sense of what it was like for the great majority of people born in the pre-internet 1950s, 60s and 70s, discussing the possibility of living more authentically. Not only as trans people, according to the rigid requirements of the medical model enforced by the NHS in the 20th century, but moving beyond this as well. This is a generation of trans and gender non-conforming people who were lucky enough to find each other, find community, and begin to force their visibility onto the streets and into popular consciousness of the UK in the early 21st century. As the second decade of the 21st century began in trans non-binary communities in the UK, notwithstanding ongoing discrimination in our daily lives, we experienced stronger legal recognition and protection with the passing of the Gender Recognition Act in 2004 and the Equality Act 2010. There were more social and support groups. Formerly LGBT organisations expanded their remits to include trans, non-binary and queer people. Transition pathways at work began to be developed, pioneered in the probation service by Helen, who we met earlier. There were challenges to media misrepresentation coordinated by Transmedia Watch and a significant public reaction to the deaths of trans women incarcerated in men's prisons, leading to new guidance being developed for the treatment of trans people in prison. It felt like an upward trajectory, the transgender tipping point referred to at the start of this talk. And this momentum continued up to the point where the issue of self-ID began to be discussed in public. Self-ID allows trans non-binary people to self-determine their gender without the need for psychiatric diagnosis, and then to make the legal changes necessary to live authentically. It's only a little simplistic to say that 2017 is the point at which what had previously been relatively sporadic and muted opposition to progressing trans liberty, at least in the limited sense of legal progress, became more focused and organised. The lobbying group Women's Place formed in 2017 with an avowedly anti-trans manifesto, and implacably the tide, never running strongly in our favour, apparently turned increasingly against us. I haven't got the time here to make this point in any depth, but it's clear that the coalition of forces that increasingly coalesced against trans people in the UK in 2017 and thereafter is broad and powerful, and also complex, involving people who came from left-leaning feminist backgrounds, often with a history of trans exclusionary praxis, working alongside the anti-trans, anti-queer campaigns being funded by radical right-wing and evangelistic US-based dark money, along with socially conservative forces in the UK. Anti-trans activity is currently infecting all mainstream media outlets and political parties in the UK. Transphobia is being weaponised as one of a number of wars against minoritized people and communities, typified by the Great Replacement theory in support of patriarchal white supremacy. This is intensified by the conditions by which what was at first a tool and lever to our individual and community self-recognition and liberation, the internet, the contagion of social media, which has enabled the easy transmission of misinformation and disinformation about trans people and trans lives, has done us no favours. The strategy of intellectually bankrupt but influential and powerful right-wing actors of engaging in culture wars has left trans, non-binary people and constituencies fragile and therefore defensive and weary of the endless ongoing battles and lack of allyship in powerful places. But still, let us consider where we are now, measured against where we've come from. I began by outlining the experience of most trans people in the UK in the late 20th century. This was of being alone, isolated, lacking community, feeling shame, lacking legal status and protections, and not daring to talk to anyone about such an important part of their lives, not in fact being able to meaningfully be themselves. They had no access to positive media representations, only very secretive and difficult to access support organisations, and most profoundly, they had no language to describe themselves positively in terms that they recognised or understood. But whatever challenges we face in 2024, our situation is very different. Despite the awfulness of much social media content, we still have the internet, and through the internet, it is possible to connect to age-appropriate support and social groups, increasingly to see positive representations of trans people in films, in books, and magazines, and actually, of course, on social media platforms. There are a range of role models in the world, people in the music and film industries, models, business people, but also in normal life, people in your workplace, people on dating sites, in your social circles, and people in families. We have 2 proud trans parents on the platform this evening. During 2024, there will have been trans prides in all 4 nations of the United Kingdom, numbering in double figures, including 60,000 trans non-binary people and our allies on the streets of London this July, the largest trans pride ever in the world, as well as many other LGBTQ+ prides themed this year around support for trans people. And formally and informally, language is changing, including wider knowledge and use of appropriate pronouns, including for non-binary people, and about what language can no longer appropriately be used. And these changes are slowly becoming embedded in everyday social intercourse. We're experiencing a shift towards a kinder language, a more inclusive language. So I want to end this presentation by talking about the experience of a 74-year-old trans woman who identifies as a lesbian called Kaylin. Kaylin told me she'd always been aware that she was different, had always been aware that she really wasn't part of her birth gender. In common with other people of her generation, she didn't have the language or any context with which to identify, so she didn't come around to managing any kind of transition until 2016-17. And Kaylin was luckier than Helen. She had the internet. She found an organisation that supported older LGBTQ+ people so she could meet other older trans non-binary people. And through meeting people there, she got to hear about trans-involving organisations supporting trans people's health and well-being, through which she accessed counselling and ultimately hormones and gender-affirming surgery. Once Kaylin committed to exploring her sex-gender needs, her pathway, though not without its challenges in relation to family, was relatively smooth and fast. The process from start to finish, if there is a thing you can say is finished, took 6 years. And when asked to describe how she now feels, she said, on the slide, "It's indescribable. The wonderment and the joy I feel as a trans queer woman. I mean, I just have such an optimism about being who I am. I just love it. I mean, I can't imagine not being. Yeah, looking back at what appeared to be a very dark period in my life, I now feel so liberated, so light, so vital, so accepting of myself, so guilt-free, so visible, so not having to hide brings me a tremendous amount of peace and equilibrium in my life. And that, to me, is my trans joy." The transgender tipping point was and remains a meaningful phrase. Over-optimistic and oversimplified, perhaps, but in remembering how far we've come, as exemplified by transgender warriors like Helen, now a published author, Ben, now happily transitioned, Lee, training people in workplaces, schools and universities about trans issues, and Helen, finally liberated and visible, there's joy. When we think about 60,000 trans non-binary people and our allies on the streets of London, and similar shows of solidarity on the streets of Belfast, Cardiff, Kilmarnock, Hastings, Liverpool, Bristol and Brighton, there is solidarity and there is joy. When we think of all the trans non-binary people of all ages in our workplaces, our schools and universities, our communities, quietly and calmly getting on with their lives, there is joy. There are challenges, some serious and profound challenges that we still face in our onward march. But in counterpoint to those challenges, we are here and we are staying, and therein there is joy. And that's it.
Good evening. That was not me, by the way. I have tried many times to get out of public speaking, but I've never gone that far. Okay, so yes, composure, and let's begin. So I'm just kind of piggybacking quite a bit off Chryssy's presentation and what she was talking about. We spoke as we decided what we wanted to talk about today. As we said at the beginning, it's time we spoke about happiness and joy and embraced some of the good stuff as well. So there are some serious bits in my talk, but I'm trying to best kind of focus on the joy that's out there. I started off with the title of Reimagining Trans Plus Futures. I think this talk could also be retitled Welcome to the Inside of Jack's Head, because this is all the stuff that goes on in my head on a daily basis. So recently, I informed a colleague that I had handed in my notice and that I planned to leave my well-established, respected, successful and secure role at my last institution. She immediately wanted to know why. in that academic way of asking why, as a challenge to try and prove my thinking wrong. I explained that my work life had ceased to bring me joy. I was once again burnt out, and I was looking towards a future of doing something that made me happy. Her response in disbelief was, "But no one's ever really happy. We might occasionally be happy. That's not normal." This conversation happened a few months ago. But these words have stayed with me. In fact, I noted them down on that very same day because they were already connecting with what I'd been thinking and writing about trans futures and critical joy. My now ex-colleague's words really struck me. After 16 plus years in academia, I know I do not look that old. Hearing such maligned resolve was not a surprise for me. But hearing it expressed in such clear, unironic terms made me realise in that moment, after dealing with the years of political and media abuse attacking trans plus lives and existence, having spent yet another long period pulling myself out of hopelessness with a promise to find joy, I realised afresh that the blessing of my queer self and of the queer experience, of knowing myself, was at the root of my survival. And not only my survival, but that of all the generations of queer and trans folk confronting the cyclical threats of eradication from the cis heteronorms of this world, was this overwhelming urge to live happy, to find peace in everyday existence despite what my external surroundings are telling me. So there's a thread throughout my years of researching family making and midwifery in Mexico, with asylum-seeking women and self-empowerment in Manchester, and in more recent years, the lived experience of trans plus folks in the UK and beyond. These are all populations deemed as vulnerable and socially excluded. They're also populations that are at the cross-section of human rights discourse and systemic oppression, whose very right to exist and live in peace is openly challenged, and this challenge accepted as justifiable in order to somehow protect other people. Yet the common theme I recognise from these seemingly separate populations is that A, their existence as a threat to others is unsubstantiated and therefore rooted in deeper causes of racism, sexism, ableism, queerphobia, and B, that their stories tell us that they're all just humans that desire to be left to live in peace without threat of violence. The need to fight back, take on activism, defend oneself or one's community is born from the actions of oppressors. It is a position that many oppressed people are forced into, when arguably they'd all prefer to be living a life to the full with friends and family, thinking about what's for dinner, have no fear for what the future holds or whether the person that they are talking to is a safe person. Activism and survival existence are the consequences of structural violence, and to lean into Bell Hooks' terminology, white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. By design, these consequences become all-consuming and distracting from the shared goal of peaceful coexistence. Fighting back in this way creates division and it breaks community. It robs us of the time and opportunity to dream and consider alternative ways of being. Futures are difficult to imagine when you're spending every day in survival mode. In this context, future is a cruel concept, something to taunt you in your current despair. Yet, as we've just heard from Chryssy, for those of us who do choose to live, the future becomes an inevitable present. It happens regardless, and as such, we deserve to be able to drown out the voices of oppression and collectively dream about what is possible. In writing this piece, I was rereading collected work on transtemporalities and what epistemologies we have available to us to imagine and anticipate a positive future. So much of trans existence is characterized by waiting. waiting to come out, for acceptance, to access healthcare, to receive healthcare, to receive legal recognition, a waiting that is imposed upon us by external forces, whilst at the same time our lived experience is anything but a linear trajectory. We live instead on queer time or transitional time. In this state of waiting, we also shift forwards, backwards, sideways. We are choreographed into being and becoming. However, as tempting as it is to get lost in this labyrinth of what I have decided to call queerizing from this day onwards, please quote me, as you will, we are here to talk about real life. To riff off of queer author Ali Smith, we are here to use our collection of stories and lived experience of what really happened in really real life to imagine alternative futures. So where do we begin? We begin by collectively reframing the narrative of trauma and by deciding the questions to ask for ourselves. Something I learned from years of working with asylum-seeking women in and around Manchester was the importance of owning and reframing narratives for oneself. Finding community is key to this. As I began to research with trans plus adults during the initial COVID-19 lockdowns of 2020, I immediately saw different sides to community and identity making. Whilst online communities have undoubtedly saved many trans plus people, both before and during the global pandemic, as we heard with the history as well, I also think that whilst people are kept physically separate, community making does eventually become an event of shared isolation. As Chryssy highlighted, since around 2016-17, the global plus trans population began to lose control of its own narrative. At an extreme level, we were never silent, but we became silenced by mainstream media, pressure groups with a great influence on governments. We entered into a temporal phase of what author Sophia Samatta terms experiments in exhaustion. Now, while she uses the term in the context of blackness and quantum realities, it really chimes with our experience as trans plus people in the UK and beyond. I don't know about anybody else here, but I am tired. I'm exhausted. I'm constantly frustrated at the various directions I get pulled into to respond to problems that have been created on the basis of no evidence, as highly damaging thought experiments. We are kept occupied and exhausted by challenges beyond our control and experience, and as a consequence, we become fragmented. Detached from our lived experience, questioning our own reality, and hoodwinked into thinking that perhaps, maybe, sometimes, we are the problem. Of course, we are not the problem. We are, in fact, along with our queer siblings, the solution. We are the potential, and our histories are evidence of how we have long imagined and made alternative futures come to fruition. The challenge is to get away from the impressions that have been created about us, to find ways to speak for and represent ourselves. Not through anything spectacular, although we do spectacular well, but through the everyday actions of living alongside others. The turning of the cultural tide against trans plus people, starting with adults and then inevitably targeting our youth, has been characterised by a wealth of people speaking about us and 9 times out of 10 without us. When trans plus voices are given space, it is those who are educated, predominantly white, cis-palatable, and presumed professionally successful who are given the opportunity to set the narrative. The high standards a trans plus person has to meet in order to be given space to speak bears no resemblance to the circus of humans allowed to speculate on our audacity to exist. We must be armed at all times with a pleasant smile, a lack of aggression, any number of up-to-date research studies, an extensive insight into legislation, and an unbounding enthusiasm to please. Whilst those who project their unresolved trauma onto us as though we were some kind of homogenous gloop are free to spout nonsense with no expectation to provide evidence to the contrary. This is precisely what is meant by experiments in exhaustion, to which I propose we seek to change through experiments in joy and healing. I do wish to note, however, that a focus on joy and healing doesn't erase trauma and suffering, but instead offers a path beyond its dominance. To create is to bring something into being in the world that did not exist through ordinary processes. Queer possibilities and trans futures are about this very act of creation. Challenging normative expectation, trans plus folk are ahead of the skills curve when it comes to queer potentiality. I was re-listening to a podcast just last week, and I was struck by a comment from the founder of the Free Black University and liberatory scholar, Mel's Owusu. They were asked who was inspiring them in their work currently, and they refreshingly answered themselves. They say, and I'm partly paraphrasing here, being trans is hard, but also transness is the sickest thing ever. How can it be that every single day a person comes into the world and you're told, you are this, you are that, before we can even verbalize our awareness or feelings of our identity? It is assigned to us and it is regulated. And so to find somewhere in yourself where you actually realize, no, I am not that, and then you go on a journey of becoming who you are, that shit is crazy, and I feel like we sleep on it. To be that demonstrates there's so much expansiveness within our interior worlds, and I feel like trans people offer a lens to explore the fact that we are more than just matter, we are more than just our bodies in the world, and going deeply inward and finding who we truly are and expressing it is in the world is testament to our imagination. As trans people, we have it within us to imagine something that we are taught is impossible. You have to be ready to defy what the world says, what out-of-date science says. You have to, and we do, imagine this impossibility, and then we go and we live it. Throughout the last few years of interviewing trans adults of all ages, some involved in activism, and the majority not, they are rarely concerned with the idea that our existence is resistance. This phrase, co-opted by the trans liberation movement and often used, does not chime with every day of most people's lives in conscious action. I think maybe because, as a phrase, it didn't originate in this movement, and many folk, when asked to reflect on the phrase, tell me that they simply desire more than to just exist. They identify a passivity in the notion of existence as resistance. Like, we're here anyway. We did that without even trying. But going back over Mel's Owusu's words in the podcasts allows me to think about how we repurpose resistance through greater recognition of our collective selves. Through this reminder that by existing as trans people in the world, we are not only imagining the impossible, but we are creating it. That does sound like a form of resistance my interviewees could get behind. In our search for everyday peace, for queer potentiality and futurity, this is what happens when you write long words and you can't speak. We need a consistent reminder of the here and now, that we are beyond other beings, and despite the pressures to conform, are making the impossible happen. To repeat the words of Owusu here and now, this shit is crazy, and we should not be sleeping on it. Like many of the people I've spoken to in my research, understanding the power of force of love as a connection took me time to understand. When you're living every day in survival mode, in isolation, and in the process of creating future from what appears to be your imagination, the meaning and the power of love becomes a very difficult concept to grasp. Why do we, as adult humans, become consumed by hate, but not so easily consumed by love? When we are abused, attacked, isolated, why is it so difficult to treat love as radical action? I think our mistake is in treating both hate and love as emotions, experienced individually, rather than experiences created through human connection. Emotions are felt, translated as something beyond our control, and therefore they are overwhelming and difficult to engage with. But can we look at this differently? If we can understand love and hate as something created via human connection, we can understand the work that is needed to create, maintain, and grow it as a force for good. Or alternatively, for hate, the work needed to deconstruct it, examining the types of connection that created it in the first place. I can only think as a parent, if I'm truly honest, that I learnt to love my children over time. Society might have fed me some bizarre expectation that as they came from my body, my newborn babies were supposed to trigger some kind of never-ending love bomb that was beyond my control. Connecting ideas around love to uncontrollable emotions is both dangerous and debilitating. It shames non-birth parents into never being able to understand such a connection, and it shames birth parents who do not recognise such feelings and choose to walk away. However, once we treat love as connection, either with others or with ourselves, we can understand it as an ongoing process. We can see its potentiality, something we can work towards whilst managing the present. Trans plus lives are constantly in the act of creating in opposition to cis heteronormative structures. And maybe the way we utilise love as connection to each other and those around us is the key to a better future. Love is connection. Love is defiance. Trans adults who survive, who find a way to exist in relative peace, are those who either learn to love themselves, are loved by others, or a combination of both. So trans futures are not just about trans lives. They are about transforming society as a whole. We exist within a very abstract concept, this thing known as white supremacist capitalist patriarchy that actually has very real consequences. Consequences that are arguably only benefit to the world minority. It is time to throw the rule book out of the window. Or is it simply time to experiment and play with the tools that we already have? Perhaps positive futures via total change can seem such an insurmountable challenge that we're setting ourselves up to fail through overwhelm at the outset. Do we need to be more humble in our search for happiness? Maybe what we do need that is missing from so much of our daily life is actually playfulness and time. Opportunity to sit where we are at, making the future possible through a presence of acceptance. Here, I come back to the choreographing of queer time, the back, the forth, the up, the down, and sideways of finding out who we are in relation to others. Of course, to play around in queer time, we need to be able to pause and step out of survival mode. And therein lies the challenge for most everyday trans folk caught in the mists of what has been termed straight time. Straight time tells us that there is no future, but the here and now of our everyday life. This straight time restrains us, and it makes future dreaming impossible. At its worst, this straight time eradicates hope, and it steals lives. I cannot imagine the last thoughts of those of us who could not see a way to escape the tightrope of straight time, other than like this: I have no future. Of the tens of trans adults I've spoken with who were almost lost, yet found the means to live on, the thoughts of what has been achieved in the present, despite of what may happen in the future, is what sustains them in the everyday. Those transitioning in later life often explain that despite their suffering in the here and now, transitioning quite literally saved them, and it provided them with a life to live. They are living future, as proof to our youth who are struggling to see their own potentiality. If I were to summarise the key concepts in queer writings on trans futures, I would piece together the following words: desire, potentiality, horizons, hope, the not quite here yet. I would like you to take a moment whilst we're all here together, physically and virtually, to close your eyes and pay attention to what images come to your own minds when you hear the following words: desire, potentiality, horizons, hope, the not quite here yet. There's a deep yearning in those words, elements of waiting and wanting, of anticipation. There is an excitement in the idea of what has not yet happened, an experiment not in exhaustion, but in finding joy and joyfulness in our community.
Okay, so now it's time for the questions. So if we have any questions in the room, we want to thank again Chryssy and Jack for this very rich and powerful presentations. So if there are any questions, please go ahead. There's one here, maybe a couple.
Yeah, we'll have a mic running around, so we'll try and get to you all.
Hi, so Dr. Lopez, I recall you mentioning that you've done some work in Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering what that is. I'm Mexican, so I was just wondering what you could have been doing, since I don't see that much activism or work done there to better trans lives or queer lives in general.
Yeah, it's very, very hidden. I mean, my research in Mexico was in HIV prevention and outreach. So I lived in Chiapas for just over 10 years.
Oh, that's where I live too.
Ah, there we go. I bet you can guess which town I lived in, where all the foreigners are. Yeah, I was, so I worked in HIV outreach and very hidden communities. I mainly worked in reproductive health care as well, with midwives and baby making. What I will say is I was in Mexico this summer, and although, you know, it's very complex to think about it as a society and existing as a queer person and existing as a trans person. For the first time in my life, I actually felt more secure and more safe when I was in Mexico with my eldest child this summer than I have felt in the UK for the last kind of at least 3 or 4 years or so. But I understand that privilege also comes from me being a foreigner in that place as well. It's different from the lived experience of a Mexican in that situation.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Other question? I think there's one here.
I wanted to know if you had any personal opinions on the characterization of trans men as victims of the transgender ideology and of trans women as predators, or mostly pedophiles is what I see in the media.
It's a good question. Do you want to go first?
I mean, yeah, I can go first, yeah. It's a reproduction of a historical discourse around gay men, for example. It's an easily reproduced othering of people. And there's been particular issues with the trans women in prison, for example, where prison is a very violent place in general, and the women in prison are susceptible to sexual violence from all sorts of different angles. And it's because trans women are particularly othered. There's a concentration on the actions of certain trans women, or perceived actions, the danger of their actions, that doesn't fall on other actual predators. And this is throughout society. The whole bathroom issue, predicated on the idea that trans women are predators, is just simply without evidence in this country or any country. And it's not for the want of trying. The people have looked for this evidence and failed to find it. I mean, it's seriously over the last decade. So very much historically grounded in lies, but reproducing older discourses as well.
Yeah, and actually, I noticed what you said there about it is about the idea of, because there's no evidence for any of it. I actually would, I'm a bit less diplomatic as well about it than you. I just think it's lazy, because it's easy. It's really easy to point to a population of people that don't have a lot of representation and the ability to speak for themselves, because how do we demonise migrants? In the same way that we demonise queer people, in the same way that we demonise that all types of women were demonised for centuries and centuries, because it's lazy, it's easy to do, it's made by people who are already in a position of power. Precisely what I was saying in the lecture as well about they're not expected to provide any evidence. Their word is enough. I'm not too aware of characterizations of trans men, because I choose to ignore it a lot of the time, and I think, I definitely know, that I benefit so much from the privilege of patriarchal society, of being a white man, that actually the attention and the vitriol and the violence goes towards women. It doesn't go towards men, it goes towards women and femme-presenting people. So yeah, but it's just laziness, basically. Get a better job.
Could I interject a minute to expand on this point? I think it's great to clarify also some things. You talked about the tipping point, and then at some point there's the trans narrative that is taken away from trans people themselves, right? That this kind of historical moment that happened quite clearly, and we can see also how that happened, as you say, with the other, or communities like the migrant communities. So this is kind of parallel. So maybe can you tell us a little bit more about this moment? What is it that led to this sort of from the tipping point to taking away the narrative?
I think my contention is partly that the tipping point hasn't been taken away. That's partly my contention. But if you talk about I mentioned in the talk, I didn't go into individual cases, but about trans women in prison, and there was some force behind campaigns. 3 trans women in 2015-16 who committed suicide in male prisons. 2 that committed suicide, 1 that was moved. And partly in reaction to that, so it was felt that they were moved wrongly into female spaces. And there's a whole discourse around men in female spaces, which completely takes away the reality and objective truth of trans women's ontology. So it's a refusal to accept trans women as women. So in reaction to something, in that case, quite specific, actually. Yeah.
There's a lot of misogyny at the basis of and then intersecting as well with trans women of colour, with trans men of colour, intersecting of racism and so forth that. And I think the vitriol towards trans women is somebody that has issues with womanhood. And also the same with a lot of prejudice against trans men as well, is because they're not seen as men. And so therefore that is tied up within misogyny as well, because they're a man with a vagina and that's weird. So that they can't be a man because men are defined by having a penis and, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. It's an inability to expand your mind a bit in terms of who we are beyond our bodies, I think, as well.
More questions?
Do we have some online,
Yeah, thanks so much. So I am very conscious of the time, and I realise that people online have been online for quite a while. So I've got 2 questions. One first off is to Chryssy, and we've had a couple of attendees going to ask a question around, you mentioned the far right. You made reference to the far right previously, and there's a couple of questions about, can you expand on that a little bit more as to what you meant? And then just building on that, and I'll read the question because it's probably quite, but again, I realise we don't have much time. There was a problem with evidence in relation to the hostility facing trans people in 2017. The usual mix of WPUK being anti-trans when it's not. There was a fundamental contradiction between the cause of joint progress since 2017 and the evocation of a trans-hostile environment. And could you explain that, or could you kind of expand upon that contradiction?
Sorry, could you go over that again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure. So the first part, there was a couple of attendees who asked you to expand upon your mention of the far right.
Yeah, sure.
So you spoke about the far right, the far right activists. Yeah. And the second part, I'll read it in full. Can you please thank the speaker, so Chryssy, for the talk. There was a problem with evidence, though, in relation to the hostility facing trans people in 2017. The usual mix of WPUK being anti-trans when it is not. It merely sets out to protect women's single-sex spaces, a provision of the Equality Act 2010, which is legal, legitimate, and part of the law of this country. More, though, there was a fundamental contradiction between the cause of joy and progress since 2017 and the evocation of such a trans-hostile environment. Could you please, such progress would not be possible if the environment were not that hostile. Could you please expand upon this, explain the contradiction?
Possibly.
How long have we got?
Very long question. Yeah.
I mean, I realise there is the numbers online. People have been hanging on for a while. So
Yeah,
if you want, if you can answer that in a minute, brilliant.
Yeah, perhaps. The question about far right activism. I mean, we don't even have to talk about far right. We can talk about right-wing anti-trans activism, which was evidenced quite clearly in the last government. A number of ministers were up to the Prime Minister, and in ministries that should have protected trans people's rights, were very much against, and were looking to change the legislation that protects trans people to not protect trans people. And you talked there about the Equality Act, and the Equality Act protects, the Equality Act has a provision to exclude trans women from women's spaces where there is a legitimate, I can't remember the wording, a reasonable and legitimate reason, which is very limited. So it's not true. But what I think the question is suggesting is that trans women can be excluded en masse from women's spaces. That's not what the law says. That's not what the letter of the law says, not what the intention of the law was, and not what the spirit of the law was. It's individual cases in very narrow, specific circumstances. So that answers some of it. Yeah. I don't really want to get into an argument about women's place, but I have shared a platform with people from Women's Place, so I do have some personal experience of that experience.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks so much.
Okay.
And then a second question, what can we as allies do to help navigate and promote queer joy? And I guess that's open to both of you.
What can we do? What can allies do? Why is it always on us to answer?
No, I think no. It did say we as allies, so I think it was people as allies.
Yeah,
what can allies do?
I'm dismissing it. It's because I get asked a lot. You know, what can we do to help? And I'm always struck by an interview that I watched with Noam Chomsky, because I think when you were desperately when you're unsure of what to ask for help, you start with yourself and your own position. So I remember a really good interview with Noam Chomsky once, and he was saying how he never receives letters from young students in what we understand to be the global south or, low-income countries going, what can we do? They're always writing to him going, this is what we're doing. And he only ever gets letters off students in first world rich countries going, what can we do? I don't know, the world is a terrible place. And that sits with me to think, right, in terms of my allyship to women, my allyship to people of colour, my allyship to people with physical disabilities and so forth is start with understanding who I am and my own privilege, researching, educating, having conversations with people and figure it out from there. There isn't a rule book that says do this, that and the other. It's who you are as an individual and how you can see outside of yourself to how you can make spaces better for other people.
Yeah, I think I just want to add to that and say it's about sitting in that discomfort of not having all the answers right away, but knowing you have the tools or the ability to get the tools to learn. I think, as you said at the beginning, too much is put on marginalised communities to be the answer when actually the answer is in the allies. Yeah. And being in this room here, being online, that is a step in the right direction. And it's you don't have to make the biggest splash in a big world. You affect what you can in your own social circles and your own lives. But I think it is about pushing through that discomfort and that fear of getting it wrong and knowing that, people will be there to support you to learn, but that you have a responsibility to do that yourself. And as you said, it's to all marginalised communities. It's not just starting with one. Yeah.
You've got to get stuff wrong. You're here at university in the seat of learning. All scientific discovery was found by making mistakes. None of it. Most of the knowledge that we have is not intentional. It was found because somebody messed up. And that's what we do on a daily basis. We all mess up.
And I think allyship also perhaps begins with believing people when they say who they are.
Yeah.
Is, I think, really important.
Were there any more questions online, Chris?
No. We do have one more. If you want to,
or maybe in the room
or should we
as
have
well.
one more? Yeah.
Let's give people the chance to express themselves. This one next.
Just run a mic to the back.
I can get it. Yeah, otherwise.
I'm hoping this works. Does it work?
Yeah.
Good evening, panel. My name is Michael Wrighton, and I just want to elaborate upon a wonderful little thing that I've heard, which is obviously straight time and trans time. For those of us who are non-trans but within the community, who can homogenise with straight time, as it were, in terms of us being transactional between the pair, again, it leads to the question of how can we best serve you? But what in particular would you like for us to transact between trans time and straight time to best serve our community and support our siblings? Because I think it's really important that, especially at this time, given the cyclical nature of society, we're entering a period of conservatism and conformity, and actually what we need to do is be liberal and be reactive and say, no, actually, there's time for change.
It's a really good question. I think I spend a lot of time thinking about time as a construct, as it's not real. And I think we'd all benefit from playing around in queer time, because this idea, this notion of straight time, this linear thing, that's got nothing to do, and it's nothing to do with sexuality or gender. It's a construct that we all get stuck on. You're born, you go to school, you go to more school, you go to university. None of us take a linear trajectory around this. And I think I think there needs to be more togetherness within our own community as queer people. I think we have got a lot of work to do to coexist and understand each other. You know, it's really, we're not there yet. And I think we need to heal and look after each other and be well for each other in order to face the straight world, to be more liberal. So I don't know, I suppose the one thing we'd say is let's spend more time together so that we don't feel that we're misunderstanding of each other. I think beginning there, you know, I think it is about that. We need to connect more, I think.
Yeah, I have a question. Thank you very much, both of you, for very inspirational talks. And I just want to understand how, because I'm very inspired by the reference to finding an alternative temporality and to focus on positivity and all this. But Straight Times is still attacking us every day, relentlessly, and we need to keep fighting the good fight. So is this some queer self-care moment in which we regain our thoughts? We focus on what really matters for us. We stop being reactive and live for ourselves. And then we keep fighting, because the questions that were raised here are about Julie Bindle's accusation of trans men erasing lesbian women as a category because of homophobia. All of these questions being asked, they go back to Straight Time and all of these things. So what I'm saying is, like, I really feel that existentially we all need to learn this lesson and learn to focus on our desires and what makes us happy. But at the same time, we cannot let go. We need to keep fighting, and in a way that protects us while also, you know, not giving up, because it's relentless, isn't it? And I don't know, it's easy to pause, because I was thinking about the proverb, you know, living well is the best revenge. Is this what we are doing? Until then we are recharge our batteries and then we can re-engage. Because I mean, I feel these exhaustions as well, and I'm not even part of the trans community. But I'm working with migrants, sex workers, you know, and all of that. So yeah, I just wanted to know what's the relation between all this and the fact that we need to keep fighting the good fight, whatever that is.
I think we need to get better at choosing the battles we want to fight. I think we've got ourselves in a state where we think we need to fight everything. And what we're doing a lot of the time is feeding the fire. You know, I have teenage children that spend a lot of time poking each other and causing arguments that actually sometimes, if they just learnt to walk away, you cannot, the power of leaving an angry person shouting into the void cannot be underestimated. I think some of it is about, again, that connectivity and deciding who we don't all need to stand there and fight. You know, we don't all want to. It's not all our responsibility. But also, we need to look after the people that do want to be on the front line. You know, and vice versa. We need to cultivate ourselves better, but we do not need to be fighting all those fights. You know, in the same, as you were saying, the arguments that are thrown against us nowadays, you can go to any history book of queer history, and everything was said to gay men. All of those things were said to lesbians. You know, that it's not new. It's so not new, it's boring. It really isn't. And so I often like to play with this idea of around the time of just going, well, if I don't respond to you, what are you going to do? You know, I don't care who says I don't exist. Like, am I a figment of your imagination? Like, no. You know, my children wake up every day and see their father and go, you're my dad. And I'll go, apparently I don't exist. We're here. So, yeah, it's a lot more complex than that. But I think we need to decide what battles we're going to fight, not them.
And also, I think that when we talk about the refocusing of trans academia, in the second International Trans Conference. Let's bring it back down to a more materialist thing about trans lives. We don't need the deep theorising all the time. This is the battle that's implicit in the questions that we got online. If we can sidestep those questions in our own lives as much as possible, because we don't need to be thinking about it in terms of ourselves. We know we exist, and exactly as you've just said, and we can know we exist on our own terms, and we can extend that into academia, into activism, because we've done all of the complex theorising about sex and gender, and it's got us somewhere, but it hasn't finished these questions about women's spaces, etc., etc. So this readjustment is necessary.
And this, and this brings us to also. I'm looking at Chris, but I also was thinking that this is kind of why are we? What you said, I'm quoting you. Why are we not consumed by love, and we're consumed by
hate,
neoliberal capitalism, etc., etc. Of course, but that's exactly the kind of maybe the then and there from the here now that we want to get to, So perhaps that's the kind of tracing that you're doing with this as well, which I find very inspiring. But just to hold on the thought, and there is a couple of questions I think from online.
Yeah, I think so. This is going to be the last question, if that's okay. So we've got. So I'll read the message. So there's a bit of a message, and there's a question as well. It's I loved your lectures. Thank you. I'm a proud mum of a trans teenager, 17, and I couldn't agree more with your analyses. I would love to know what one thing would you want to change now to turn the narrative around in this country?
Cool.
Change the world, Jack.
What one thing?
We can do it.
All trans people deserve a free holiday every year to the island of their choice. Just, from a parent of also a gender queer and a queer child to another parent of a trans child, we're doing all right. It's not up to us to make the world's change.
And on that note, I think we can bring this to a close, Thank you again. A big round of applause for our speakers.
Thank you everyone for being here, both online and in person, and thank you for creating a safe space for reimagining trans futures and for trans joy. And I hope we all leave this room today thinking about what we've talked about and thinking about creating that loving connection that Jack so succinctly spoke about. So thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for not running away.
Thank you.